They didn't even knock on my door. The realization hit me like a physical blow as I stood in my kitchen, frozen with a dish towel in my hands, listening to my cousin Carla's voice drift through the thin walls from next door. She was on the phone, with her mother, and her words cut through the afternoon air with casual cruelty. He doesn't even need to be there. We're the ones who live here, after all. My hands trembled as I set down the towel. The he she was referring to was me, Sarah. But in their minds, I had become so invisible, so irrelevant, that my gender didn't even register anymore. I was just an obstacle, a leftover piece of furniture they had to work around. I moved to the back porch on unsteady legs, my cold cup of coffee forgotten as I sank into the weathered wooden chair that had been my sanctuary for the past 3 years. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tried to process what I had just overheard. They were having a family meeting about the land. Our land. The land where I had been born, where I had buried my parents, where I had chosen to stay when everyone else scattered to the winds of their ambitious city lives. And they hadn't invited me. It wasn't the first time they had brushed me aside like dust on an old photograph. But this was different. This was deliberate. This was them making decisions about my life, my home, my future, as if I were already dead and buried next. To my father in the small cemetery behind the oak grove. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story reaches into the quiet corners where people like us learn to make ourselves small. I watched them arrive that afternoon, one by one, like crows gathering for a feast. They walked past my little caretaker's house, without so much as a glance in my direction, their arms full of manila folders, and their hearts full of plans that didn't include me. Uncle Robert with his expensive suit and his calculating eyes. Aunt Margaret with her pursed lips and her clipboard of criticisms. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in months, maybe years, all suddenly concerned about family business. They filed into the main house, my grandfather's house, my father's house, the house where I should have been sitting at the head of the table. Instead, I was the outsider looking in, pressed against the glass of my own inheritance like a child begging for scraps. I could see them through the large windows, their silhouettes moving around the dining room table where my grandmother used to serve Sunday dinners. The same table where she had taught me to knead bread with patient hands, where my father had helped me with algebra homework under the warm glow of the chandelier, where my mother had announced her pregnancy with the baby brother I never got to meet. Now it was covered with papers and possibilities that didn't include me. The rage started as a small flame in my stomach, then spread through my chest like wildfire. But I swallowed it down, the way I had learned to swallow everything else, the slights, the jokes, the way they introduced me at family gatherings as, "Sarah, you remember her? She's the one who stayed behind," as if staying was a character flaw. As if loving this place enough to tend it, to nurture it, to sacrifice my own dreams for its preservation, was somehow a sign of weakness instead of strength. Ever since my mother died when I was 22, I had become the keeper of things. The keeper of memories, of traditions, of the graves that needed flowers, and the house that needed repairs. While they built their lives in glass towers and suburban developments, I had remained rooted in the red clay soil of our ancestors, growing, quieter and smaller with each passing year. I had become the ghost haunting their family story. But ghosts, I was learning, can be more powerful than the living imagine. That night, after their cars had disappeared down the gravel driveway, after their voices had faded into the darkness, I walked the land. The moon was full and silver, casting everything in an ethereal glow that made the familiar landscape look like something from a dream. The oak trees whispered secrets in the wind, their branches reaching toward the stars like arms raised in benediction or supplication. I knew every inch of this place. Every depression in the earth where the creek used to run before it changed course. Every stone marker my great-grandfather had placed to mark the boundaries. Every wildflower that bloomed in spring. every bird that nested in summer, every leaf that fell in autumn. This land was written in my DNA, embedded in my soul like a second heartbeat. I walked the fence line, my bare feet finding the familiar paths even in darkness. The cows in the pasture lifted their heads as I passed, their eyes reflecting the moonlight like lanterns. They knew me. They trusted me. Unlike the humans who shared my blood, these creatures understood that I belonged here. I stopped at the old cemetery, where weathered headstones marked the resting places of 5 generations of my family. My great-great-grandmother, who had homesteaded this land with nothing but determination and a broken heart. My great-grandfather, who had expanded the farm during the Depression. My grandparents, who had modernized the operation and built the main house. My parents, who had died too young, leaving me as the sole guardian of their legacy. I knelt beside my father's grave, my fingers tracing the letters of his name carved in granite. "They think I don't belong here, Daddy," I whispered to the night air. "They think I'm just the caretaker, just the one who stayed behind because I wasn't brave enough to leave." But I remembered the day. I was 17, gangly and uncertain, about everything except my love for this place, when my grandfather had called me into his study. His hands, weathered from decades of farm work, had trembled slightly as he handed me an old envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with red wax. "Your father wanted you to have this when the time came," he had said, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't understand then. "He made me promise to wait until you were old enough to understand what it meant." Inside that envelope was a deed. Legal, witnessed, notarized. The land, all 50 acres of it, from the creek bed to the county road, from the old barn to the new fence line, was mine. My father had transferred ownership to me on my 16th birthday, a year before he died in the tractor accident that changed everything. But I had kept it quiet, hidden it away like a secret treasure, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. Even as they sneered at my little shack, even as Carla made jokes about my thrift store clothes and my unmarried state, even as they treated me like a charity case, like someone they tolerated out of obligation rather than love. I had my reasons for the silence. I had spent those years learning, reading, researching. I had attended every county council meeting, studied every zoning law, consulted with lawyers and land developers and environmental specialists. I had transformed myself from a grieving farm girl into a knowledgeable landowner, all while they thought I was just playing house in the caretaker's cottage. The meeting they had held that afternoon, the meeting I wasn't invited to, was to finalize their plans for parceling off the property for development. I had pieced together their intentions from overheard phone calls and accidental glimpses of their paperwork. They wanted to sell to a developer who would transform our family legacy into a subdivision called Heritage Oaks, complete with cookie-cutter houses and artificial ponds. They thought it would be easy. They thought no one would object. They didn't even think they needed my opinion. They were wrong on all counts. I had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, even though I hadn't known exactly when it would come. I had obtained updated surveys, researched the property's history, documented every improvement I had made. I had quietly established relationships with local conservation groups and historical societies. I had even started the process of having the property designated as a heritage site, protecting it from development in perpetuity. But most importantly, I had learned to find my voice. The voice they had tried to silence with their dismissals and their assumptions. The voice that had grown stronger in the solitude of my exile, nourished by the soil beneath my feet and the sky above my head. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. I dressed carefully, not in my usual faded jeans and work boots, but in the navy blue dress I had worn to my mother's funeral, the one that made me look serious and capable. I pulled my hair back into a simple bun and put on the pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. I was going to reclaim my seat at the table. Not because they had invited me, but because the table was mine. The second meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. I knew this because Carla had been talking loudly on her phone again, discussing the final details with someone, probably a lawyer or the developer. I listened from my kitchen window as she complained about having to come back so soon, about how eager everyone was to get this whole thing settled. At 9:55, I walked across the yard that separated my little house from the main house. My hand was steady as I knocked on the front door, the door I had walked through thousands of times as a child, but which had somehow become foreign territory. "In my adult life," Uncle Robert answered, his face registering surprise and then irritation. "Sarah, we're in the middle of something important here. Maybe you could come back later." "Actually," I said, my voice calm and clear, "I think I need to be part of this conversation." He started to object, but I was already moving past him into the hallway, my heels clicking on the hardwood floors my great-grandfather had installed by hand. The sound echoed through the house like an announcement of my arrival, like a bell tolling the hour of reckoning. The dining room fell silent when I appeared in the doorway. 7 faces turned toward me with expressions ranging from confusion to annoyance to barely concealed hostility. The table was covered with documents, architectural plans, and what looked like a contract ready for signatures. "Sarah," Aunt Margaret said, her voice sharp with disapproval, "this is a private family meeting." "I know," I replied, moving to the empty chair at the head of the table. My father's chair, my grandfather's chair, the chair that should have been mine all along. "That's why I'm here." I reached into my purse and withdrew the envelope my grandfather had given me all those years ago. It was more weathered now, softened by time and handling, but the deed inside was as valid as the day it was signed. I placed it on the table, open to the page with my name written in my father's careful handwriting, witnessed and notarized and legally binding. The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. I could hear the antique clock on the mantelpiece ticking, could hear someone's shallow breathing, could hear the whisper of paper as Uncle Robert leaned forward to read the document that had just shattered all their carefully laid plans. "Before you make any decisions about the future of this property," I said quietly, my voice carrying the weight of 3 years of silent preparation, "you should know who actually owns the land you're trying to sell." No one moved. Carla's eyes flicked to her mother, who had gone pale as winter morning. An uncle I barely knew cleared his throat nervously. Someone dropped a pen, and it clattered against the table like a gavel falling. Uncle Robert's hands shook as he held the deed, his eyes scanning the legal language that made my ownership undeniable. This can't be right," he stammered. "Your father never mentioned—" "My father mentioned it to the person who needed to know," I interrupted, my voice steady despite the years of hurt threatening to crack my composure. "He transferred the deed to me on my 16th birthday. Grandfather was the witness. It's been legal and binding for over a decade." Aunt Margaret snatched the document from her brother's hands, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. "But you never said anything. You let us think." "You never asked what I thought about anything," I replied, the words carrying the sting of truth. "You assumed I was just the hired help, just the poor relation who stayed behind to tend the graves and feed the chickens. You assumed I had no voice in my own inheritance." The architectural plans scattered across the table suddenly looked like what they were: elaborate fantasies built on a foundation of ignorance and arrogance. The contract with the developer, with its promises of quick profit and easy money, became worthless paper in the face of legal reality. Carla found her voice, first, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "But the Heritage Oaks development, we already talked to buyers. You promised them something that was never yours to give," I said, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt the power of speaking absolute truth. "This land has been mine since I was 16 years old. Every decision about its future is mine to make. I watched as the implications dawned on them one by one. The money they had already spent on lawyers and surveyors, the deposits they might have taken from eager developers, the family fortune they had counted on before it was ever in their hands. All of it built on the assumption that I was powerless, voiceless, irrelevant. Why? Uncle Robert's voice cracked like a teenager's. Why didn't you tell us? Why let us go through all this planning if you knew you could stop it? I looked around the table at these people who shared my blood, but had never shared my dreams. Because I needed to see what you would do when you thought I couldn't stop you. I needed to understand exactly how little I mattered to the family I had sacrificed everything to stay close to. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire they couldn't put out. I saw shame flicker across some faces, defiance across others. But mostly, I saw the dawning realization that they had underestimated the quiet girl in the corner for the last time. "What do you want?" Aunt Margaret asked, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Money? A percentage of the sale? What's your price for getting out of our way?" The question revealed everything I needed to know about how they saw me, even now. Even faced with legal documents and undeniable proof of my ownership, they still thought I could be bought, dismissed, convinced to disappear for the right price. "I want you to leave," I said simply. "I want you to take your plans and your promises, and your assumptions about my life, and I want you to leave my property." The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had been years in the making. Finally, Uncle Robert began gathering his papers with the mechanical movements of a man whose world had just been turned upside down. The others followed suit. There, chairs scraping against the floor as they pushed back from the table that was no longer theirs to sit at. Carla paused at the doorway, her face flushed with embarrassment and rage. "You'll regret this, Sarah. Family doesn't turn on family like this." "Family doesn't exclude family from decisions about their own inheritance," I replied, my voice steady as bedrock. "Family doesn't make plans behind closed doors and assume silence means consent. You taught me what family isn't supposed to be. Thank you for the lesson." She left without another word, and I listened to their footsteps echo through the house, their voices murmuring in the hallway, their car doors slamming like punctuation marks at the end of a long, painful sentence. The sound of their engines, fading down the gravel driveway, was the sweetest music I had heard in years. I sat alone in the dining room, surrounded by the detritus of their abandoned plans. Architectural renderings of cookie-cutter houses scattered like fallen leaves. Spreadsheets full of profit projections that would never materialize. Legal documents that were now worth less than the paper they were printed on. But I wasn't thinking about their defeat. I was thinking about my victory. Not over them, but over the part of myself that had believed their assessment of my worth. I was thinking about the years I had spent apologizing for existing, for staying, for loving this place too much to leave it behind. I walked through the house that was finally, legally, undeniably mine. Every room held memories of the family we used to be, before grief and distance and different dreams had pulled us apart. The kitchen where my grandmother had taught 3 generations of women to cook. The living room where we had gathered for Christmas mornings and birthday parties. The study where my grandfather had kept his books and his secrets and his faith in the future. This was my inheritance. Not just the land and the buildings, but the responsibility of keeping our family's story alive, even if I was the only one left to tell it. That evening, I called my lawyer, the one I had been quietly consulting for the past 2 years, preparing for exactly this moment. "It's done," I told her. "They know now." "How do you feel?" she asked, and I realized it was the first time anyone had asked me that question in months. "Anchored," I said, and the word surprised me with its accuracy. "I feel anchored." The next few weeks brought a parade of phone calls. Angry calls from relatives who had just learned that their development dreams were dead. Pleading calls from the same people, trying to convince me to reconsider. threatening calls from lawyers representing the developer, until my own lawyer made it clear that harassment wouldn't change the legal reality of my ownership. But there were other calls too. Calls from conservation groups who had heard about my decision to protect the land from development. Calls from historical societies interested in preserving the property's heritage. Calls from agricultural colleges wanting to study our soil composition and water systems. Calls from people who understood that some things are worth more than money. I started a small organic farm on the back 40 acres, growing vegetables and herbs that I sold at the farmer's market in town. I opened the main house for historical tours once a month, sharing the stories my grandparents had told me about the early days of our settlement. I established a small scholarship fund for local students studying environmental science or agriculture. Slowly, carefully, I built a life that honored both my family's past and my own future, a life that didn't require anyone else's permission or approval, a life rooted in the red clay soil and reaching toward the endless sky. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had excluded me from their meeting because they saw me as irrelevant, powerless, forgettable. But in doing so, they had given me the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that I didn't need their approval to claim my rightful place in the world. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation in the mail. Carla was getting married, and apparently, the family had decided to extend an olive branch. The invitation was addressed to Sarah plus guest, as if I were any other distant relative they felt obligated to include. RSVP'd for one. The wedding was held at a country club in the city, all white flowers and string quartets and the kind of manufactured elegance that comes with a hefty price tag. I wore the same navy dress I had worn to confront them, my grandmother's pearls, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. They were polite to me, of course. Wedding day politeness, all forced smiles, and careful conversations that avoided any mention of the uncomfortable truths we all knew. I played my part, congratulating the bride, complimenting the decorations, making small talk about the weather and the food and anything else that didn't matter. But I noticed the way they looked at me now. Not with dismissal or condescension, but with a kind of wary respect. I was no longer the poor relation to be pitied or ignored. I was the woman who had outmaneuvered them all, who had turned their assumptions against them, who had claimed her power when they least expected it. During the reception, Uncle Robert approached me at the bar, his face flushed with alcohol and regret. "Sarah," he said, his words slightly slurred, "I want you to know, we never meant to hurt you. We just thought, you thought I didn't matter." I finished for him, my voice gentle but firm. "You thought my feelings and my future were less important than your plans and your profits. You thought silence meant consent, and invisibility meant irrelevance." He stared into his whiskey glass, unable to meet my eyes. "We were wrong," he mumbled. "Yes," I agreed. "You were." I left the wedding, early, driving home through the familiar countryside as the sun set behind the rolling hills. The land stretched out on either side of the road, some of it developed now, some of it still wild, some of it tended by families who understood that the earth is not just a commodity to be bought and sold, but a trust to be protected for future generations. When I reached my driveway, I sat in my truck for a moment, looking at the house that had raised me, the land that had shaped me, the life I had chosen to build in the shadow of their rejection. The porch light glowed warm and welcoming, and I could see my garden thriving in the distance, neat rows of vegetables and herbs that would feed my neighbors and my community. I had won something more valuable than money or revenge. I had won the right to define my own worth, to tell my own story, to plant my own seeds in the soil of my ancestors and watch them grow into something beautiful and sustaining. The family meeting I had been excluded from was supposed to be about the future of the land. Instead, it became about the future of the woman who truly understood what that land meant, what it was worth, what it could become in the hands of someone who loved it more than profit margins and development deals. They had tried to write me out of the story. Instead, they had given me the pen. Some roots grow so deep in the darkness that when they finally break through into the light, nothing can uproot them again.